always true. And this is because in France there was a very powerful intellectual fascist tradition, essentially, that's what it was, which goes right through to today, and even to the new right. And there's a degree to which in the Sorbonne, say in the 70s, you could see a poster saying, Drew La Rochelle lecture this afternoon. He committed suicide, of course, after the war because he was a collaborationist intellectual with Abetz and other people in the German Cultural Ministry in Paris in occupied France at that time. Now, so it's not uniform. These things are process-led and dynamic. And it doesn't just happen in economics and anthropology. It happens in psychology. It happens in sexology. It happens in English literature. It happens in the creation of new discourses, such as cultural studies, which is the dissemination of ideas about mass culture. And it happens in critical theory. Critical theory is a viewpoint that's grown up across the arts and across the humanities and even into areas of law like criminology, which can also be considered to be one of these ologies, if you like, one of these subjects. Other areas are history of art, aesthetics, in philosophy courses, philosophy itself, and so on. The Anglo-American world, of course, had an empirical view of philosophy, largely since Hobbes, but certainly since Russell in the 20th century, and a hostility to European philosophy, which meant there was less Marxist influence here. But the trouble with Bertrand Russell's type of philosophizing is it doesn't believe that any of the big questions can be answered. And therefore philosophy itself becomes slightly pointless and a cul-de-sac where you discuss the language you use to arrive at a concept that you might arrive at, for which there are multiple interpretations and which you are forever unsure. In and of itself, that's the preparation, this radical tepid uncertainty, which leads from conservatism to liberalism and from liberalism to something that's a bit more certain and lies to the left of it. Everything in Western societies has moved to the left throughout the 20th century. I'm not a Christian, but you could argue that after Vatican II, many Catholics became Protestants. Many Protestants became liberals. Many secularist liberals who are ex-Protestants moved further to the left and adopted views that they would have regarded as semi-extreme in the past, as long as they're not connected to physical force, militant working class politics, vanguardism, and the absolute politics of communism. You have many left-wing liberals now who have views which are to the left of hardcore communists in the 20s and 30s, and they don't realise that, and they're horrified by the atrocities of Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot and all of the others. But what they don't realise is that they have imbibed a doctrine of totalitarian niceness and squeaky clean correctness about these concepts, which existed in a way that their minds were attuned to before they became conversant with it. Now, this march through the institutions has also been a march through the media, because when you have an intellectual clerisy, it tends to control the conceptual ideas in the society, and the way the society talks to itself in modernity is through the media, and also propaganda and ideas about how you talk to the media. Most polytechnics and post-polytechnics now, because polytechnics were once vocational institutions, of course, dominated by people who tended to support the Labour Party. Now they've been upgraded to new universities, or universities have been downgraded to new universities, which are polytechnics. Because if all have a degree, what does it mean? In America, you can go to a university and you don't necessarily, outside the Ivy League, have to have the qualifications to get in. So you have a remedial course. There's a considerable number of people from certain types of racial minorities on those remedial courses. Taught to do English, taught to do maths, and then they do sports science or sports psychology. They won't be doing physics, they won't be doing mathematics, they won't be doing metaphysics, they won't be doing Shakespeare. There are certain colleges now that have those about whether Shakespeare should be on the English course. But that's a mistake, you see, because democracy is always a mistake. Hardline Marxists, when they allow the students to vote, the students, even though they're liberal, often come up with more conservative results than the professors want. That's the logic of vanguardism. You see, you don't allow them to decide. You say Shakespeare's a reactionary Elizabethan bigot with undue essentialist notions that you shouldn't permit. The notion of essentialism has come in the last 30 to 40 years in relation to great fads in intellectual life. It has to be understood that for the last 100 years or so, all mainstream, hardcore Western intellectual developments have been atheistic. They've taken atheism as read, not as something to be debated. The first great ideology after the war was existentialism, which contained many elements, including a dissentient far-right strand as well. Existentialism was replaced by a new creed, fad, wave of history, whatever you want to call it, called structuralism, which relates to ideas at the beginning of the 20th century called formalism. Then people got bored with structuralism. Structuralism was around at the time of the student revolts in the late 1960s. Not totally a left-wing idea, but in a way bent towards the left by certain ideas. If the revolutionary left on campus couldn't take an idea as read, they would turn it around. Hegel was not a left-wing thinker, but left-wing Hegelianism emerged. And Marx was a part, with Engels, of a group of left Hegelians that used to meet in a beer cellar prior to the German Revolution of 1848 to discuss left theory. Similarly, structuralism, left structuralism begins to emerge, particularly with Levi-Strauss in anthropology and with Saussure in linguistics. These ideas relate to certain currents in modernist art, in particular in the late 19th and early 20th century. And as we approach this subject area, we get a bit closer to home, who's nominally the sort of the hook that I'm hanging this particular talk on. Now, you can't do English at a contemporary British university, certainly outside Oxbridge, where there's just a received canon, and not come across critical theory. Critical theory is based upon a notion called deconstruction, and most people who are sort of intellectually minded have heard the word deconstruction somewhere floating around, floating in the back pages of the Observer, colour supplement, that sort of thing. They've heard the word. Deconstruction is another word for post-structuralism, which is the ideology, the new fad, that replaced structuralism in the 60s and 70s. It's most so closely associated with a thinker called Jacques Derrida, who wrote a number of books basically saying that history doesn't exist, that biology doesn't exist, that the writer of a text does not exist. There is only the text. There is only the grammar of the text. A painting can be a text, a poster can be a text, a film can be a text. Only the text, nothing but the text. It's the view that essentialism leads to the gates of Auschwitz, which is repeated again and again as a mantra within these particular courses. They believe that any prior identity, say the statement men and women are different, the John and Jane book, you know, a child says men and women are different. Wrong on every count. Prior essentialism as to gender, revolutionary, sub-genocidal, reactionary ideology in relation to the specification of male and female. Don't you know men and women are interchangeable? Don't you know that they are the same? But if somebody says, but don't they have different brains? Lies put about by eugenicists, linked to reactionary and essentialist ideas, again, rerouted to the ovens. Listen to your theory. And of course, in these areas, to think differently from the nature of this theory is to be impossible, because you will not finish that course, you will not even get a 2-1, which is the sort of median level for your average student in that course, if you don't go along with this. And some of this thinking relates to Western ideas that are very far back. Because in medieval scholasticism, there's the doctrine of hermeneutics, whereby you analyse the text of the text of the text, you look inside it to see the hint of the divine that is there, and some of these ideas actually do come out of that particular trajectory, you see. So in some ways, it's a very ancient thing that's being repositioned and is being reused for hostile purposes. Only the core theorists in this sort of area, Deleuze, Guattari, Derrida, and others, would actually know that that is the case. When the Enlightenment and modern scientific rationalism began, and they argued that the schoolmen were concerned about the number of angels who danced on the top of a pen, and philosophy was about natural process and law of nature, as the Greeks believed 2,000 years before, 1,500 years before their postulations, of course, there was a degree to which they thought they got rid of that type of thinking. But interestingly, that type of thinking, which in some ways is very reactionary, quote unquote, has come back through these new left ideas. The one thinker that's partly outside all of this and has a special status as a monster within the 20th century is Martin Heidegger. Now, Martin Heidegger was an extreme essentialist and was a religious thinker, but was highly influenced by these ideas of extreme hermeneutics and the peeling away of the onion of the text. Heidegger has one book that's 400 pages saying what is thinking, or what is the nature of thinking. Heidegger wrote 80 books, all 80, most of which have never been released. And although Heidegger is one of the most radical thinkers of the 20th century, Heidegger's political affiliation, if only for a year, between 1933 and 1934, has meant that, in a sense, he has become an unperson. After the war, he was allowed to write and continue to write. He used to write in the Black Forest. He had a wooden cabin in the Black Forest, and he just used to commune in this this particular wooden fastness, this shed almost, with nature and by himself, in pure theory. Now, a lot of these ideas are based upon pure theory. They're based upon the idea that the bourgeois, the enemy in Marxian terms, goes to life with common sense. The Marxist goes